Now, in my last scouting report video, I talked about Mike Williams from Clemson, the wide receiver who many feel is the #1 prospect at the position in the 2017 NFL Draft. And I can see part of it. I see that size, quickness, speed, athleticism combination, the big playability and possibilities, and I can see why people would get enamored. And I'm sure there will be several teams that will end up grading him as the #1 wide receiver on the draft board because, as I've talked about, when grading these prospects, when I kind of do it in a general sense, that certain teams will favor certain traits or characteristics more strongly, or they might not go as in depth in terms of some of the things that I do, or they'll go more in depth with other things that I do not because they have the capabilities to that I do not. So if Mike Williams ends up being the #1 wide receiver taken in the 2017 NFL draft, I'll understand it. But for my money, the #1 wide receiver prospect in the 2017 NFL draft class is Corey Davis from Western Michigan. And to me, there's actually a little bit of a gap, more than I expected between him and Mike Williams. I thought it was really going to be one of those neck and neck type of deals for me, and it wasn't. When I look at Corey Davis, I see his skill set. I see what he was able to do at college. I see how he projects to the NFL level. I view him as much more NFL ready, a much more consistent type of weapon. And while he might not be as explosive as Mike Williams in theory, I think he's more explosive than people give him credit for and much more likely to contribute day one at the NFL level. That's just my opinion. But when it comes to Davis and what I like about him as a prospect, one of the real things that stands out to me is just the fact that there's not any huge glaring weakness in his game. He has a lot of things that he does really, really well, honestly, in terms of a wide receiver. He does most everything well, or relatively well, or pretty damn well. There are things that he can work on, sure, but you could say that about any prospect coming into the NFL level, but that doesn't mean that the kid's not a really good talent or a borderline special talent. And I don't know if I classify Corey Davis as a special talent, but I think he's a really good talent and definitely worthy of a first round pick and a top 16 pick in the 2017 NFL draft. Now, in terms of the traits that I like the most about his game, and I think that will translate the best to the NFL, I look at his hands. He was a pretty reliable pass catcher at Western Michigan the past 4 years. It's crazy too, going from like a 2, 3 star recruit playing in the Illinois suburbs to going to Western Michigan, playing under PJ Fleck, and being that dude. I mean, this guy was impressive. He'll occasionally have the execution drop more than the focus drop, and sometimes he can get in a little bit of trouble in terms of when his hands are fully extended. That's where he seems to drop the ball the most. But I think he does, in general, a pretty good job of keeping the ball away from his body. Does a pretty good job of looking the ball into his hands on a consistent basis. In general, a very reliable pass catcher. And when you look at guys like Corey Davis, similar to a guy like a Cooper Kupp or a Zay Jones, when you watch them on film sometimes, it'll you'll see some drops, but then you have to remember the sheer amount of volume that they get as a pass catcher and the few drops that they ultimately do have means that they still have really reliable hands. There was a reason they were targeted so frequently in college. But his hands, I think, help. I think he's a really, really, really good route runner. He's pretty crisp in and out of his breaks, although sometimes I think he could be a little deliberate in setting up his breaks. In general, though, he's really, really sharp in terms of his cuts, especially when he's uh, setting up his break and he's heading out or on the slant. There's so many things that he can do as a route runner, and I think he has a very expansive route tree that will translate well to the NFL level. What I really like about him is the type of route tree that he has is equally effective, I think, on the outside and in the slot. And in fact, it might be even better in the slot, but he's definitely a guy to me that can play outside in the NFL. Whereas Mike Williams, you might put him in the slot, but it's more because of size mismatch potential and athleticism. But his route tree in no way matches to being a slot type of receiver. Corey Davis can do enough to be able to run routes anywhere, which helped overcome helps overcome a lack of real explosiveness, a lack of real elite type of quicks. Um, he compensates for that for being really good with his body control, being, like I said, really crisp in and out of his breaks. So you don't have to be explosive. Is if you play like you're explosive, and that's what he does. I think he does a good job of being able to generate separation. I don't know that he's elite in that. It's something he can work on a little bit. I feel like he's a quality route runner. Like I said, he can be a little deliberate sometimes going into his breaks, but he can be very sharp coming out of them. He didn't face a lot of press coverage in the MAC at Western Michigan, so what is he going to be able to do at the NFL level, especially when he plays on the outside? Because some of those bigger physical corners, the Akib Talibs of the world, the Richard Shermans of the world, they're going to want to get up into him and they're going to want to press him and get him off of his spot. How is he going to be able to react to that? How is he going to be able to handle that? So he's going to have to work on his ability to beat press coverage. He's going to have to get a little bit crisper getting into his breaks. But I don't anticipate him having a ton of trouble separating at the NFL level. And even in that case, you're still talking about a dude 6'3", 210 pounds or so. You know, he can sit there and create opportunities. He can create throwing alleys. He can get himself open even when he's not really open because he has a decent catch radius. Now, he's not a guy necessarily that's going to jump out of the gym or out of the stadium to go get the ball, but he can win some jump balls. He can go up there and get the ball at its highest point relatively well enough. And like they said, in terms of his catch radius, the biggest thing that I think holds him back a little bit is sometimes he can have a little bit of trouble with those balls that require him to have his arms fully extended. Not anything that I think isn't correctable at the NFL level. And even then, again, coming back to his hands, it's still really, really good. What surprises you for a guy that lacks elite speed and elite quickness is just how good of a threat he is as a runner after the catch. I mean, he's really, really dangerous in the open field. For a guy that's not all that explosive, not all that quick, not all that fast, he has pretty good lateral agility. He can stop and spin on a dime. He can make some tacklers, frankly, look bad. He has that ability in the open field to make you miss. He has the ability to run through some arm tackles of defensive backs. Again, you talk about a guy that's 6'3", 210 pounds. He can run through those arm tackles. He can be tough to tackle, and I like the way that he runs with the ball. He runs with attitude. He runs hard, and he fights for that extra yardage. He's not just a guy that's looking to tiptoe through the tulips and get the hell out of bounds, or will catch the ball over the middle and he'll go right down. No, he's not that type of dude at all. And if you get this guy the ball when he's already on the run, if you hit him in stride, you know, his speed will surprise you. Again, it's not elite, but it's better than he's probably going to be given credit for in the process of the draft, especially because of the ankle injury that he had that required surgery. He's not going to be able to run for teams. It doesn't sound like during the combine, pro day, pre-draft workout process. But I promise you, this dude has more speed than you might anticipate. He really does. In terms of quickness, you know, sometimes we talk about guys aren't that naturally quick. They can get quicker. I mean, again, you're still talking about even a kid like Corey Davis, all of like 22 years old, hasn't even reached his physical peak yet. You can get him to do plyometrics. You can focus on strength training. You focus on working on quickness. You can get guys to be quicker. And sometimes that can even just come in improving and sharpening the fundamentals. But I don't anticipate it being a major problem for him at the NFL level. It could only maybe be a problem for him initially if he struggles to beat the press coverage from some of the bigger physical corners on the outside in the National Football League. But again, when I watch him, I see just a complete and well-rounded football player. And I love some of these guys that have these great stories. Like for Corey Davis, his brother played at Marshall, was a record setter in the MAC there, went on to have a cup of coffee in the NFL Titus. You know, he went from being a two-star recruit to being an All-American. He is the all-time MAC leader in reception yards and touchdowns. He was always pretty good in the 3 bowl games, including this bowl game back in January against Wisconsin. You know, you were wondering where he was, and then all of a sudden you realize he put together a pretty nice game, and that one touchdown he had against Wisconsin just showed how special of a kid he can ultimately be. I know people are going to talk about him dominating against a slightly lower level of competition, but you know, against some of the bigger name schools, against some of the bigger teams, he had good performances. So you could see against higher level of competition that there really wasn't much of a drop off at all. There just wasn't. Ultimately, I think this kid is the most well-rounded wide receiver in this draft. I think he could do the most things at the wide receiver position in this draft. And I like the fact that he's a guy that if I'm looking at somebody being a potential number one wide receiver, his production didn't drop off at all once Daniel Braverman went into the draft last year, which you would think maybe now that more defenses have shifted towards him and are focusing on him, that might lead to more bracket coverage, double coverage, and as a result, safety shadowing him over the top. He's not going to produce the same. And he didn't skip a beat. He produced just as well, if not slightly better. He's been that big man on campus. He's been that franchise type of wide receiver. And you look at a dude like a Corey Davis, who sat there and went to Western Michigan. I think in 2013, his first year there, they were like 1-11. It's funny. 4 years later, PJ Fleck, who I competed against in track and field in high school, mind you, when he was at, I think it was Maple Park Canelan, you look at Corey Davis, he was a part of a program that went from winning one game as a freshman to by the time he was a senior, they were undefeated heading into their bowl game against Wisconsin. So this is a guy that's enjoyed quite a bit of success. This is a guy that's been the BMOC in a situation on a really, really good team. Like you look at a Mike Williams, he's got a Deshaun Watson. He's got a Wayne Gallman in the backfield. He has Jordan Leggett at tight end. You have the talent that Clemson had on the defensive side of the ball with guys like Watkins and Tankersley. And you look at Corey Davis, and he doesn't really have that. He had to be the number one dude. He had to be the one that opposing defenses tried to stop, and they still couldn't stop him. He dominated. Now, in terms of his overall grade, I gave him a 91.5. He will ultimately, I promise you, as I've already graded 6 wide receivers, and I'm going to grade more, yes, and none of them I'm sure will match up to Corey Davis. He is my number one wide receiver in the 2017 NFL Draft. My NFL comparison for him is Brandon Marshall. I was trying to go back and forth trying to think about who Corey Davis kind of reminded me of. There are elements that remind me of Brandon Marshall. Kind of similar size type of package. A guy like Brandon Marshall was not explosive as an athlete, but he was quick enough. He's a quality enough route runner to be able to get open on a pretty consistent basis. Really good body control. Brandon Marshall's probably better against press coverage than Corey Davis, but I'm also talking about Brandon Marshall, who's now a 10-year pro. Plus, we're not talking about the guy when he was coming out of Central Florida and he was a 4th-round pick in the draft. But in terms of trying to project the type of receiver that Corey Davis could be at the NFL level, it could be Brandon Marshall minus all the headaches and the off-the-field baggage bullshit. And if you could get a Corey Davis to be a Brandon Marshall type, then don't you think he's worth a top 16 pick in the 2017 NFL Draft? Well, I happen to think so. And I think the team that ultimately does draft him will be very, very happy with the guy that they get.